The tornado tore through Millbrook and sent dozens of wounded toward the only hospital still operating, a hospital that lost power just as the first ambulance pulled in. No lights, no monitors, no reliable way to keep the critical patients stable. Except through the one man everyone had laughed at 3 weeks earlier for warning them this could happen. The storm hit Millbrook at 9:04 p.m. A wedge tornado that touched down 2 miles from the hospital and tracked directly through the center of downtown before anyone had finished evacuating the waiting room. Windows exploded inward on the west wing a full 10 seconds before the sound of the tornado itself reached anyone's ears, a pressure wave hitting the building like a fist, throwing a supply cart across the hallway, sending a rack of IV bags crashing to the floor in a spray of shattered glass and saline. The building shook once, hard, glass shattering somewhere on the second floor, and then the lights went out, every light, every monitor, every automated system that Dr. Reeves had called redundant 3 weeks earlier, all at once. All together, plunging the entire into a darkness broken only by emergency exit signs and the distant flash of lightning through blown-out windows. Screaming somewhere down the hall, a crash cart rolling loose, hitting a wall in the dark. Somewhere a monitor's dying battery let out one last plaintive beep before it too went silent. Swallowed into the general chaos of a building that had never once practiced functioning without power. Generator should be kicking in, someone called out, voice tight with the panic of a person who'd never once had to function without one. It didn't kick in, not right away. Somewhere in the building, a transfer switch had failed along with half the electrical panel, and for the 90 seconds that followed, Millbrook Regional's entire emergency department ran on nothing but battery-powered flashlights and the training instincts of whoever happened to be standing closest to a patient. A resident somewhere near the trauma bay was shouting for someone to find a working flashlight, voice climbing toward panic in the dark. A patient on a monitor that had just gone silent began crying out, disoriented, unable to tell whether the silence meant something had gone terribly wrong with his own heart, or simply with the building around him. Elias's headlamp was on before the first scream reached him. 8 years of habit had already answered the question before his mind caught up to it. Talia. With me, he said to the young nurse frozen near the nurse's station, voice flat and immediate in a way none of his coworkers had ever heard from him. We've got a ventilated patient in Bay 4 losing power to that machine right now. I need you bagging him manually in the next 10 seconds or he stops breathing. Talia didn't ask questions. She ran, for 1/2 second, watching her go. Elias was somewhere else entirely, a collapsed building 4 years ago. A different young colleague running toward the same kind of impossible instruction with the same kind of trust he hadn't earned yet, before either of them had any way of knowing whether it would actually work. He pushed the memory down the way he always did and stayed with the room in front of him. The generator finally caught, coughing to life on partial power, enough for critical monitors. Not enough for the whole floor, while outside, the storm kept tearing through what was left of downtown Millbrook, sending the first wave of injured toward the only hospital left standing within 20 miles. They came in faster than anyone could process them, not 1 or 2 patients, but wave after wave. Ambulances and pickup trucks and neighbors carrying neighbors. The parking lot filling with more wounded than Millbrook Regional had ever handled in a single night. A man with a 2x4 through his shoulder. A mother clutching a child with a head laceration bleeding through a torn dish towel. An elderly woman in a wheelchair, disoriented, oxygen tank nearly empty, evacuated from a nursing home whose roof had partially collapsed. A teenager carried in by 2 neighbors, leg bent at an angle that told its own story before anyone got close enough to confirm it. Behind them, more gurneys, more stretchers, more people who'd been fine an hour ago and now weren't, the count climbing past 20, then 30. Faster than anyone could track it in the dark. Elias moved through all of it the way he'd moved through 100 disaster scenes before this one, not rushing. Exactly. But never once wasting emotion. Every decision made in the half-second it actually required and not a moment longer. He sorted patients by a system nobody at Millbrook had ever seen in practice, only ever read about in a training manual nobody expected to actually need. The ones who could wait. The ones who couldn't. And the small, terrible category of people who needed immediate intervention or they wouldn't survive the next 10 minutes regardless of what anyone did. A second-year resident, visibly overwhelmed, grabbed Elias's arm at one point, asking which patient to see first out of 3 arriving simultaneously. Elias didn't hesitate. Chest injury first. He's tachypneic and I don't like his color. Leg fracture second. He's stable enough to wait 4 minutes. Head lack third. It looks worse than it is and the bleeding's already slowing. He was already moving toward the first patient as he said it, trusting the resident to follow the logic instead of needing it fully explained. The resident followed. It was the first of many moments that night when people who outranked Elias on paper simply did what he said. Because what he said kept turning out to be exactly right. Dr. Reeves arrived from the parking lot 15 minutes into it, soaked, staring at an running on half power with a controlled chaos that looked nothing like the chaos she'd expected. She'd left her car half a mile away, abandoned in traffic that hadn't moved since the sirens started, and run the rest of the way through rain that hadn't fully let up even after the tornado itself had passed. "Report," she said, finding Elias directing traffic near the triage desk. "Working triage by injury severity, not order of arrival," Elias said. "I've got Talia running manual ventilation in Bay 4 until we can confirm generator stability. Non-critical patients are being held in the hallway, not the waiting room, because the waiting room's window blew and it's not structurally safe." Reeves stared at him for a half-second too long, taking in the makeshift color-coded tags he'd improvised out of nothing more than colored tape from a supply drawer, marking patients by priority in a way she'd only ever seen described in a textbook she hadn't opened since residency. "How do you already have a system running?" "Because I've done this before," Elias said, already moving to the next patient. "Not here. Somewhere it happened a lot more often than anyone wanted it to." He didn't stop to explain further. There wasn't time. And there were still a dozen more patients coming through doors that had lost their automatic function along with everything else in the building. 40 minutes in, with the holding at partial power and Elias's makeshift triage system somehow keeping pace with an intake rate that should have overwhelmed a hospital twice this size, the second failure hit. The generator, already carrying more equipment than it had ever been sized to handle, hit its overload threshold and tripped. A safety cutout designed to protect the unit from burning out entirely, but one that plunged the fully dark for the second time that night the moment it fired. Somewhere nearby, a defibrillator's charge indicator died mid-cycle, and for one held breath, nobody in that room knew whether the machine would recover its charge or whether they just lost the one tool that might matter most in the next several minutes. "We're losing Bay 4 again," Talia called out, voice cracking. "He's not breathing on his own. I need light." Elias was already there, headlamp beam cutting through the dark, hands finding the bag valve mask by feel before his eyes had even adjusted. "I've got him. Count with me. Squeeze on 1, release on 3. Not fear. Focus." His hands didn't shake, even with the whole building dark around him. Because his hands had done this exact motion 1,000 times in places with far less light and far worse odds than a small town with a broken generator. Somewhere behind him, the mother with the injured child was crying, quiet and controlled, trying not to add panic to a room that already had enough of it. Elias called out without turning around, "She's going to be okay. Head lacerations bleed like this. It always looks worse than it is." He didn't know if that was fully true yet. He said it anyway, because a scared mother needed something true enough to hold onto for the next 4 minutes, and 4 minutes was about as far ahead as anyone in that room could actually plan right now. Once the girl was stable, stitched under a headlamp beam with the same steady hands he'd used on patients in far more dangerous rooms than this one, the mother caught his sleeve before he could move to the next bay. "You don't understand what tonight would have looked like without you," she said. "I need you to hear that clearly, not just have it be a thing I said in a scary moment." "I hear it," Elias said. "I just don't know what to do with it yet. Ask me again once I've slept." She let him go with a small, disbelieving laugh, the sound of someone who'd just watched a man deflect a mountain of gratitude with the same efficiency he'd used to save her daughter's forehead from a much worse scar. The elderly woman's oxygen tank alarm started chirping somewhere near the hallway. A thin, insistent sound competing with everything else happening at once. A nurse Elias didn't recognize by name yet, new to nights, froze for half a second too long, staring at the dying tank with no clear plan for what came next. Swap tanks. There's a spare rack by the supply closet. Elias called to her, still counting breaths for the ventilated patient under his hands. Second shelf, marked with orange tape. You have time. Move steady, not fast. She moved. The tank swapped clean. Alarm silencing. And Elias let himself register, for exactly 1/2 second, that the system he'd built out of nothing an hour ago was somehow still holding. The man with the 2x4 through his shoulder had gone quiet in the corner, shock finally catching up to him after the initial adrenaline of the injury wore thin. Elias crouched beside him between other tasks, checking his pulse by feel in the dark. Unwilling to let a stable-looking patient become an unstable one simply because nobody had time to check twice. "Talk to me," Elias said. "Tell me your name and what you were doing before the storm hit." "Frank," the man said, voice thin but present. "Watching the game. Didn't even hear the sirens till the window blew in." "Frank, you're doing fine," Elias said. "The wood may actually be helping control the bleeding right now. Believe it or not, we're not touching it until we've got full light and a surgeon standing by. Stay talking to me if you can. It helps me know you're still with me." Frank kept talking. Unsteady, but coherent. And Elias moved on to the next patient with one more piece of the room accounted for. One more person he wouldn't lose to the dark simply because nobody had checked. The generator caught again after 90 more seconds that felt considerably longer than that. Lights flickered back up. Monitors rebooted. And the ventilator in Bay 4 resumed on its own. The patient's chest rising and falling under machine power again instead of Talia's exhausted hands. Talia sat down hard on the floor the second it was safe to. Hands shaking. Adrenaline finally catching up to a body that had been running on pure instinct for the better part of an hour. "You did that exactly right," Elias told her, crouching beside her for the 2 seconds he could spare. "That's not a small thing. Most people freeze the first time. You didn't." By midnight, the worst of the storm damage had made its way through Millbrook Regional's doors, and the had somehow, impossibly, held every critical patient stabilized. Nobody lost. The generator finally running steady on a repair the maintenance crew had managed under Elias's direction using nothing but a flashlight and a set of tools meant for something else entirely. Elias had recognized the problem the moment the second outage hit. A generator carrying more equipment than it was ever sized for, tripping its own safety cutout rather than burning out. He'd told the maintenance supervisor exactly that. Standing back and letting the man do the actual work. Cut the non-essential circuits. Bring the load back under threshold. Let the unit reset and hold. It was the supervisor's hands on the panel. The supervisor's 15 years of training doing the technical part. Elias had simply known, from watching the same failure happen once before in a hospital half a world away, what the problem actually was. Never would have thought to check the load first. The supervisor admitted afterward, still a little stunned. Would have spent an hour chasing the wrong fault. You'd have found it eventually. Elias said, "I just happened to already know what it looked like." The rain had finally stopped outside, leaving the parking lot littered with debris under a sky gone eerily clear. Stars visible for the first time all night through a gap in clouds that had spent the last 3 hours trying to tear the town apart. It was the FEMA regional coordinator, arriving to assess disaster response capacity, who stopped short in the doorway partway through his walkthrough. "Navarro," he said, staring at Elias like a man confirming a memory he hadn't expected to need tonight. Elias Navarro. Frontline medical relief. Elias didn't answer right away. The coordinator kept talking, filling the silence with the momentum of someone who'd been waiting years for a chance to say this out loud. "I coordinated logistics for the response after the earthquake in your sector, 4 years back," the man said. "Never forgot the name." Your team held a collapsed regional hospital together for 6 days with no reinforcements and half the supplies you needed. I lost count of how many times your name came up in the after-action reports. I didn't know you'd come back stateside. A couple of nearby staff members, still cleaning up from the worst of the storm's aftermath, had stopped what they were doing to listen. Dr. Reeves, who'd been quietly watching Elias work all night without once interrupting him, turned from the patient she was charting. "You ran international disaster response," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "For 8 years, Elias said. "I don't usually mention it. It's not relevant to running a night shift most nights. It was extremely relevant tonight," Reeves said. The coordinator glanced between them, sensing a conversation that had layers he wasn't fully part of, and gave a small nod before continuing his walkthrough, leaving Elias standing in the ambulance bay with a version of himself suddenly visible to a room that had spent 3 years assuming they already knew the whole shape of him. Reeves found him an hour later, near the supply room, restocking a crash cart the same way he had at the start of the shift, as if the last 4 hours hadn't happened at all. She stood in the doorway a moment before speaking, watching him work with the same unhurried precision he'd shown all night. Nothing in his posture suggesting the last few hours had cost him anything at all, though she suspected, watching closely enough, that they clearly had. "I laughed at your blackout drill idea 3 weeks ago," she said, without preamble, in front of the whole staff. "I want you to know I've been thinking about that particular kind of arrogance for the last hour, and I don't like what I found." "You weren't wrong that the systems are usually reliable," Elias said. "You were wrong that usually is the same as always. That's a generous way to let me off the hook." "I'm not letting you off the hook," Elias said. "I'm telling you the difference matters. Because the next administrator who dismisses a drill request is going to be standing in a room exactly like this one someday. And I'd rather you remember tonight than remember being right about redundant systems." Reeves didn't have a quick answer for that, and to her credit, she didn't try to invent one. She sat down on an overturned supply crate, the exhaustion of the last 4 hours finally catching up to her all at once. "I've run this for 6 years," she said. "I've never once had to think about what happens if every system I trust fails at the same time. Tonight I found out I had no real answer for that question, and you had one before the lights even finished going out." "Why didn't you ever tell anyone what you used to do?" she asked. "You could have led with that 3 weeks ago. Made the drill mandatory instead of a suggestion I could brush off." Elias considered the question honestly before answering it. "Because for 8 years, being needed meant watching people die anyway, no matter how good I got at the job. Every skill I have came from a place I don't particularly want credit for surviving." He was quiet for a moment, choosing whether to say the rest of it out loud. "I lost someone in the field. A colleague, Josephine, best logistics coordinator I ever worked with. Dead from a fever nobody caught in time because we were all too busy triaging everyone else first. I told myself afterward that if I ever found myself back in a room like tonight's, I wasn't sure I could survive it a second time. I came home because I wanted a version of this work where being needed didn't cost quite so much. Quiet felt safer than being the guy with the resume everyone expects miracles from." "Tonight wasn't quiet," Reeves said. "No," Elias agreed. "But nobody died tonight either. First time in longer than I want to admit that I've walked out of a room like that one without losing someone in it. I'll take that trade." Reeves looked at him for a long moment, something behind her eyes finally settling into a kind of respect she clearly hadn't expected to be offering a night shift nurse 3 hours into her own shift ending. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I just gave," she said. "I'll say the rest of it in front of the same staff meeting where I laughed at you the first time. Seems only fair." She kept that promise 2 weeks later, standing in front of the same conference room. The same staff. The same chairs arranged the same way they'd been the night she'd smiled at Elias's idea and moved on to the next agenda item without a second thought. 3 weeks before the tornado, Elias Navarro asked this department to take emergency preparedness seriously. She said, not softening any of it. "I dismissed it as excessive. I was wrong. And I want that on record in the same room where I was wrong out loud the first time. We're implementing his recommendations in full." Starting with a real blackout drill next month. And I'd like everyone to understand exactly why that change. A murmur moved through the room. Several of the same staff members who'd laughed 3 weeks earlier now looking distinctly uncomfortable in their chairs. Replaying their own small contribution to a dismissal none of them had thought twice about at the time. Elias sat near the back, uncomfortable with the attention in a way that had nothing to do with modesty, and everything to do with years of deliberately staying unremarkable. He didn't stand up to say anything. He didn't need to. Millbrook Regional ran its first real blackout drill 6 weeks later. Generator repairs completed. A new transfer switch installed. The whole staff walking through a simulated outage with Elias, reluctantly, at Reeves's insistence, helping design the protocol. He didn't take the leadership title Reeves offered him afterward. He didn't want the meetings, the visibility, the version of himself that came with a name people would recognize in a hallway. He agreed instead to run informal training sessions twice a year, off the books. No title attached. Because that felt like the kind of contribution that let him keep doing the work without becoming the work's public face. Reeves pushed back gently on that decision more than once. You'd be good at the title. Better than good. I know, Elias said. That's part of why I don't want it. Titles come with expectations I already know how to meet, and already know exactly what they cost. Reeves didn't argue further after that. She'd learned, over the last 6 weeks, that some of Elias's boundaries weren't worth pushing against twice. She did, however, insist on one thing he couldn't easily refuse: a formal letter in his personnel file documenting exactly what had happened that night. Not for recognition he didn't want, but as a matter of record for the next time anyone questioned whether a night shift nurse's judgment deserved to carry weight in a crisis. You don't have to read it, she told him, sliding the letter across her desk one afternoon. I just needed it written down somewhere that outlasts both of our memories of tonight. Elias read it anyway, standing in her office doorway, and folded it back into its envelope without much comment beyond a small, private nod that suggested it mattered more than he was willing to say out loud. Talia found him at the supply cart a few weeks after the storm, coffee in hand, and set it down without much ceremony. I looked up frontline medical relief, she admitted. After that night, read about some of what your teams did overseas. It's a lot. It was a lot. Elias agreed. That's mostly why I don't talk about it. I get that now, Talia said. For what it's worth, I'm glad you were here that night instead of somewhere else entirely. So am I, Elias said, and meant it more plainly than he'd meant most things in longer than he wanted to admit. The mother whose daughter had needed the head laceration stitched found him in the hallway a month later. Daughter in tow. A small hand-drawn card in an envelope that the girl insisted on delivering herself. She wanted to say thank you, the mother said. I told her it might be strange to thank a stranger for something she doesn't fully remember, but she insisted. The girl held out the card. A crayon drawing of a headlamp with a wobbly, oversized beam of yellow light. Mom said you had a flashlight on your head, she said. Matter of fact, I thought that was cool. Elias crouched down to take the card properly. It's one of the more useful things I own, he told her, and meant that plainly too. The girl studied him for a moment with the particular seriousness only children manage convincingly. Mom said you fixed the lights so the doctors could see me. Something like that, Elias said. A lot of people helped that night. I was just the one holding the flashlight. That's still important, the girl said, with the unshakable confidence of someone who had clearly given this exact question serious thought on the car ride over. Elias found he didn't have a way to argue with that, so he didn't try to. He still kept the headlamp in his scrub pocket every shift, storm or no storm. Some habits, he'd learned a long time ago, weren't worth losing just because the emergency that built them was finally, mercifully, over. Some nights, walking out to his car after a quiet shift, he still thought about Josephine, not with the same raw weight he used to carry, but with something closer to gratitude for everything she'd taught him before the flood took her. He thought she would have approved of Millbrook, in her own blunt way. She'd always said the best kind of disaster response was the one nobody outside the room ever had to hear about. because it meant everyone inside it had done their job well enough that the story never needed telling. For 4 years, Elias had taken that philosophy to an extreme even Josephine probably wouldn't have recommended, disappearing so completely into ordinary work that nobody around him ever learned what he was capable of until a night forced the question open. He wasn't sure he'd go back to hiding quite that thoroughly now. But he also wasn't interested in becoming anyone's headline. Somewhere in between those two instincts felt, for the first time in a long while, like a place he could actually stay. The people who prepare quietly for disasters nobody else believes will happen are easy to dismiss right up until the moment they're the only ones who know what to do. Worth asking who's careful. Unglamorous caution you've laughed off lately. And whether you'd actually want them in the room if the lights went out tonight.